Hey everyone, it's Blake here with ChessPathways.com, and in today's openings video, we're going to be talking about the Nimzowitsch Defense. The Nimzowitsch Defense is a somewhat uncommon response to the king's pawn opening. After white plays e4 here, the Nimzowitsch Defense is black playing knight to c6. Nimzowitsch was certainly one of the most important players in chess history, making contributions to opening theory in many different openings, including the Nimzo-Indian defense, but this particular defense has kind of been left behind, mostly because it doesn't stop white from playing this move d4 and grabbing the full center. If we look at the analogous position in the queen's pawn opening, on the other hand, after d4 and black playing knight f6, this is a very popular response because it does stop white from advancing this e-pawn to e4 and grabbing the full center. But in the king's pawn opening, that does not work. This queen supports the d-pawn and white is able to play d4. Now that said, just because the Nimzowitsch defense is not popular these days doesn't mean it's necessarily bad. Black definitely has ways to play in this position, so that's what we're going to look at today. Black has two main moves here, either d5 or e5, both moves that strike back against this center and challenge white's space advantage. So let's start by looking at pawns d5, and the game can really go in many different directions after this move. At first, this looks similar to the Scandinavian defense, where black challenges this e4 pawn with this d5 pawn, but after white takes here and queen takes d5, we see an advantage that black gets that they don't have in the Scandinavian defense, and that's that this knight is already here attacking this d4 pawn, so white's not able to just kick this queen away right away. Knight c3, of course, would be met by queen takes d4. Instead, after e takes d5, queen takes d5, white might play knight f3 first to support this d4 pawn, but now black can play bishop g4, and after bishop e2, possibly playing knight f6, and we actually transpose to a line from the Scandinavian defense, but it's the knight f3 variation of the Scandinavian defense, not the knight c3 version. I'll just show you so you can see what I'm talking about. After e4, d5, the Scandinavian defense, e takes d5, queen takes d5, the main move here is knight to c3, but there's another line that continues knight f3, bishop g4, bishop e2, knight f6, d4, knight c6, and it's the same position here. So it is true that e takes d5 is going to lead to a Scandinavian defense in all likelihood, but black is avoiding the main lines there with knight c3. They're forcing white to play this side line of the Scandinavian with knight f3. So some players might want to avoid this with white and try something else here. For example, e5 is a possible move, and this looks kind of similar to the advanced variation of the Caro-Kann. We get this fixed center, but this bishop's path has not been closed yet, and this bishop can develop to f5. For example, after bishop f5, black simply gets that bishop out of the pawn chain. They can play e6 next. You might argue that this knight is somewhat misplaced here on c6 because black wants to play c5, of course, and try to break down this white pawn chain, but it's definitely nice to get this bishop out of the pawn chain where it's not locked in on c8 like in a French defense, and in the Caro-Kann, black has to waste some time to make c5 happen anyways, because they spent one tempo playing c6 and another one playing c5. So the lost tempo here having to move this knight again later on might not make a big difference. Also, because it's harder to play c5, black might just try to tear down the pawn chain the other way and play f6 later on. But aside from these nuances, this is pretty similar to the advanced variation of some other king's pawn openings, where white locks up this center early and black has to play against the pawn chain. White has one other option here, at least one other main option here after d5. They can also simply play knight to c3 to maintain the pawn tension for now. They don't take yet, they don't push yet, they just simply develop a piece and defend this pawn. And black has a couple ways to play here. Black could play e6, transposing into a kind of rare line of the French defense. Usually after a e4, e6, d4, d5, knight c3, black would not play this move knight c6, but it is a possible move. Or if black does not want to transpose to this line, they want to keep the game in original Nimzowitsch defense territory, then after knight c3, they could take here on e4, and they're actually threatening to win this d4 pawn. So white cannot take back here on e4 right away. White has to play the in-between move d5, and after knight e5, white will often play here queen d4, just attacking this knight and kind of forcing it to move again unless black wants to play the very weakening f6. The game might continue knight to g6, queen takes e4, knight to f6, and now queen a4 check, bishop d7, and bishop b5. And we end up in kind of an original position here where white is maybe a bit better because of their space advantage, but black is certainly doing okay. The big question for black is going to be how to get this dark squared bishop into the action. Alright, we've covered all the main possibilities after d5. Let's take a look at black playing e5 here. White has a few options here. First of all, white could play knight f3 and transpose to a normal e4, e5 opening. This is just the Scotch game, and we're going to come back at the end of this video and look at white's attempts to try to drag the Nimzowitsch defense back into normal e4, e5 territory. But if white's not interested in that, white has a couple ways to play here. White could push this pawn to d5 and kick that knight away, or white could simply take on e5. So let's start by looking at d takes e5 here. And after knight takes e5, white has a couple ways to play here. White could play knight f3 and just try to exchange this knight off. Also, f4 looks very principled, trying to punish black for striking at the center without a pawn supporting this e5 pawn, and really grabbing the full center here with the e pawn and the f pawn. But black could try to argue that this is somewhat weakening of the white king, and that black's going to get some play for this as well. So white pulled together one sample line here to show how the game might go after f4. Let's say knight to g6, and now both sides are just going to develop some pieces. Knight f3, bishop to c5, bishop c4, d6, knight c3. Black plays bishop e6 here, trying to trade off this powerful bishop here, eyeing the f7 square. White's just going to keep developing here and play queen e2 to defend that bishop. Bishop takes c4, queen takes c4, queen d7. And here, white sometimes decides that now is the best moment to play f5. This looks like it's giving up the outpost here on e5, but it turns out the knight can't actually come to e5 because now this pawn is overworked. After knight takes e5, if black takes back, of course they will lose this bishop, and black is lost here. So instead, after f5, black will often play knight g to e7, and knight 6 to c7. I guess both knights are actually the g knights. And here white could play bishop g5 here, just keep on developing, and white tends to score pretty well from this position. That said, black's certainly in the game. Black might try to castle long at some point and try to imbalance the position. This bishop is still keeping white from castling short. Black might try to play f6 here, just kicking this bishop away. And there was one game that continued bishop f4, and now knight to c6, a very logical move, bringing this knight closer to the center and giving this other knight its square back that it needs to develop. So that's what might happen after d takes e5. Let's also look at d5, just taking a space advantage and kicking this knight away. This is also going to lead to some locked centers, so let's take a look at how the game might go. One sample line is knight c to e7, and now white can play c4, grabbing more space. That's very consistent with their choice to play d5 here. And this almost starts to look like a pawn structure like you might see in the King's Indian defense, where white has the light squares here in the center, black has the pawn here on e5. Black probably needs to move this knight again, because it's really in the way of the rest of their development. So knight to g6, knight c3, knight f6, bishop e3, both sides are just developing here. Black needs to decide what to do with their dark squared bishop. It would be kind of awkward to fianchetto it now like you usually see in the King's Indian defense because this knight's in the way. So black will sometimes just play bishop to b4 and pin this knight to the king. After f3, black could decide to give white doubled pawns here by exchanging on c3. And now after black plays d6, white's most popular move here is to try to get rid of their doubled pawns and play here c5. In a position like this, you might see black later try to play for f5 and to start expanding on the king side, because that's where their pawn chain is kind of pointed in this direction. So some pretty similar ideas to some other locked center kind of positions. The execution is just going to be a little bit different because the pieces are in different locations. For example, this knight having to go to e7 and then to g6. So those are some of the main lines of the Nimzowitsch defense with d4. All in all, a lot of those lines are considered to give white a slightly bigger advantage than they might expect in a lot of other openings, but the advantage from black's perspective is that if you're a Nimzowitsch defense player, you're probably seeing these positions all the time as black, whereas your opponent with white, they probably hardly ever study these positions because they have so many other openings to worry about when they play e4. They're going to be worrying about the Sicilian defense, e5, the French defense, the Caro-Kann, the Scandinavian. They're not really going to be investing much time in studying these Nimzowitsch defense lines, and you probably know them by heart if you specialize in playing knight c6 here. So in light of that, against knight c6, some players with white will try to avoid the Nimzowitsch defense altogether and try to steer the game back to a normal e4, e5 opening by playing knight to f3 in this position. Black's objectively best move here is probably to play e5, and now we're right back into a normal symmetrical king's pawn opening, and white's probably happy to play this position. They've probably seen this position many times. But if you're a Nimzowitsch defense player, you probably don't want to go back to a king's pawn opening, so let's talk about a couple options that black has to keep the game in original territory after knight f3. Black could certainly just play something like d6, but now black's not really going to be able to challenge the center in one turn like we just saw in some of those other Nimzowitsch defense lines. white can just continue with d4, and the black position is a little bit passive here. If black tried to play e5 too early, white might be able to take there pretty favorably, or once again, we're just right back to an e4, e5 opening after white plays something like bishop b5. We're actually in the Steinitz variation of the Roy Lopez. So if black does not want to play e5, let's say they play knight f6, attacking this pawn, white just plays knight c3, and now I guess black can play e6. And this is a possible way to play, it's just considered kind of passive for black. So let's look at some other possibilities here after knight f3. d5 is possible, but this isn't really much of an improvement over the Scandinavian defense. In fact, it's probably a worse version. After e takes d5, queen takes d5, knight c3, the queen's just getting kicked away. There's no d4 pawn here you can take, like we saw in the other version. And after something like queen to a5, d4, we're just playing a normal mainline knight c3 Scandinavian defense, but with the moves knight f3 and knight c6 thrown in, and that doesn't necessarily favor black. A lot of times in the Scandinavian, black wants to swing this queen back to c7, and that's going to be harder to do now. So d5 is not too popular. Well, I would recommend, if you want to keep the game in Nimzowitsch Defense territory here against knight f3, and you don't want to go back to a king's pawn game, you can play this move f5. It's actually going to be hard for white to hold on to their extra pawn. I've faced this a couple times in tournaments, and both times I actually had a surprisingly difficult time proving an advantage. If white takes here on f5, you simply play d5, and threaten to win this pawn back next turn. It would be a bit dangerous for white to try to be greedy here. For example, after g4, you can probably just play h5 and strike back against this pawn chain white's building that he can't really maintain. So most players here with white will just give the pawn back, simply play bishop b5 to pin your knight. You can take here on f5, and now the main line is knight to e5, trying to exploit this pinned knight. But here black can play the somewhat surprising queen to d6, simply adding more support here to the c6 knight. And in some lines, if white's not careful, this queen might even hop to b4 at the right moment to attack this bishop. White's usually going to castle early to try to avoid anything like this. But for example, one continuation goes d4, knight f6, let's say white simply castles, and now knight d7 is a popular move, just breaking this pin and challenging this knight here on e5. So this f5 move here on move 2 might be a good option to keep this game in Nimzowitsch Defense territory and not go back to an e4, e5 opening. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. Please make sure you visit chesspathways.com right now. I'll put a link down in the description. Go there and get signed up. It only takes a couple seconds, and I will send you a free move-by-move guide to chess thinking when you sign up. I want to help you become the best chess player you can be, so if you enjoyed the video, please do that right now. Go visit the site, get signed up, and I will see you there. Thank you.